The Hidden Hand. Tracing the real Illuminati. Before we begin, I want to thank everyone who subscribed after our last investigation. Your support keeps these deep dives possible. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button because what we're about to uncover will change how you see the world around you. This isn't science fiction. This isn't fantasy. This is documented history that powerful people would prefer you never connect together. Opening. The symbol that never dies. Pull a dollar bill from your wallet. Look at the back. There it is, staring back at you from above an unfinished pyramid. The all-seeing eye. The eye of providence, they call it in textbooks. But why does this same symbol appear on currency used by millions of Americans every single day? Why does it hover over the words announcing a new order of the ages? This isn't the only place you'll find it. Turn on any major award ceremony and you'll see celebrities covering one eye in photographs, forming pyramids with their hands, wearing jewellery emblazoned with this ancient emblem. Walk into corporate headquarters around the world and variations of this symbol adorn their logos. Attend a United Nations assembly and the architectural choices echo the same geometric patterns, the same visual language of hierarchy and observation. For centuries, this single symbol has haunted the margins of history. Governments deny its significance. Mainstream historians dismiss the connections as coincidence. But what if the Illuminati never vanished into the dustbin of history? What if it simply adapted, evolved, and became something far more sophisticated than a gathering of men in robes? What if the secret society succeeded so completely that we don't recognise we're living inside its creation? Tonight, we trace the bloodline of power from an 18th century Bavarian classroom to the digital surveillance grid that monitors your every click. This is the story of how a banned secret society became the invisible architecture of modern civilization. Act 1. The Birth of the Order. The date is May 1st, 1776. While American colonists are months away from declaring independence across the Atlantic, something equally revolutionary is beginning in a university town in Bavaria. The location is Ingolstadt, a city in what we now know as Germany, though back then it existed as part of the Holy Roman Empire's fragmented landscape of principalities and church-controlled territories. Adam Weishaupt, a 30-year-old law professor, sits in a candlelit room with 5 trusted colleagues. These aren't common men, they're philosophers, intellectuals, freethinkers who've grown frustrated with the suffocating power of the Catholic Church and the brutal monarchies that rule through divine right. Weishaupt has been planning this moment for years, ever since he was appointed to a chair of canon law that had been held by Jesuits for decades. He's seen firsthand how religious orders operate, in secrecy, wielding influence through networks of loyalty rather than public decree. Now he intends to create something similar, but aimed at the opposite goal. He calls it the Order of the Illuminati. The name comes from the Latin word for enlightened, but it means something specific in this context. These men believe that humanity can be freed from superstition, from the manipulation of churches and kings, from the ignorance that keeps populations obedient and afraid. They believe that reason, science and philosophy should guide civilization, not religious dogma or inherited aristocracy. They believe in the perfectibility of human society through knowledge. Their stated mission sounds almost noble when you read it in the historical records: to free humanity from superstition, to end the tyranny of monarchies, to liberate minds from religious control. But there's something else embedded in their founding documents, something that becomes clear when you read between the lines. They don't just want to educate the masses, they want to guide them. They want to become, in their own words, the invisible hand that steers civilization toward enlightenment. The structure Weishaupt creates is brilliant in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. The order uses a system of degrees, or levels, similar to Freemasonry, which already exists as a powerful network across Europe. New members start at the bottom, knowing only what they need to know. As they prove their loyalty and discretion, they advance to higher levels, gaining access to deeper secrets and more influential connections. The highest levels know the true agenda. The lower levels simply follow orders, believing they're part of a benevolent educational fraternity. This design serves two purposes. First, if the organisation is exposed, the lower level members can honestly say they know nothing about any conspiracy because they genuinely don't. Second, it allows the order to operate through proxy, using enthusiastic recruits to advance goals they don't fully understand. It's a model that intelligence agencies would later perfect in the 20th century. Within 10 years, the Illuminati accomplishes something remarkable. They successfully infiltrate Masonic lodges across Europe, essentially hijacking an existing secret network and bending it toward their purposes. They attract powerful members, not just intellectuals now, but bankers, military officers, and aristocrats who see opportunity in this new philosophy. Baron von Nied, a prominent Freemason, joins and brings with him entire lodges that shift their allegiance to Weishaupt's vision. The order is growing too fast, becoming too bold. Members start writing letters that discuss their influence over court decisions, their ability to place Illuminati sympathisers in positions of authority, their plans to reshape education systems. These letters will later be intercepted, and they're damning. The Bavarian government, alerted to rumours of a secret society working against church and state, begins investigating. In 1785 they issue an edict banning all secret societies. Weishaupt's home is raided, documents are seized, the order of the Illuminati is officially declared destroyed. Weishaupt himself flees to Gotha, where he lives under the protection of sympathetic nobles, writing philosophical treatises until his death decades later. Officially, the story ends here. The Illuminati existed for 9 years, got caught, and was dissolved. It's a historical footnote, nothing more. But ideas don't die when organisations are banned. The men who were Illuminati members didn't suddenly forget what they believed. The networks they built didn't evaporate. The philosophy of enlightened control, of guiding civilization from behind the curtain, didn't disappear. It metastasized. It went underground, not as a single organisation, but as a methodology, a way of thinking about power that would resurface again and again under different names, in different countries, across different centuries. The Illuminati died in 1785. Unofficially, its ideas were only beginning to take hold. Aced II, the Shadow Empire. The 19th century opens with revolutions spreading across Europe and the Americas. The French Revolution has just torn down the monarchy and executed a king. Napoleon is redrawing the map of Europe through conquest. The Spanish colonies in the Americas are breaking free. The world that existed for centuries, built on kings and churches, is collapsing. And people are asking questions. How did this happen so quickly? Who organised these movements? Who benefited? Anti-Masonic pamphlets begin circulating in major cities. They make accusations that sound paranoid to modern ears, but they're based on documented facts. They point out that leaders of the French Revolution, including Robespierre and Danton, were Freemasons. They note that independence movements in the Americas are led by lodge members. They argue that secret societies are coordinating these upheavals, using revolution as cover for a broader agenda of centralized power. In America, these concerns reach the highest levels. John Quincy Adams, who would become the 6th president, writes extensively about his fears of Masonic infiltration in politics. In a letter from 1828, he warns that Freemasonry has become a separate system of loyalty that competes with national allegiance. He's particularly troubled by the Morgan affair, where a man who threatened to expose Masonic secrets disappeared and was presumably murdered. The scandal triggers a massive backlash. The Anti-Masonic Party forms in 1828, becoming the first successful third political party in United States history. For several years, being openly Masonic becomes a political liability. Lodges close, membership plummets. It seems like the secret society networks are being dismantled by democratic pressure. But here's what the historical record shows if you look carefully. While public Freemasonry declined, its influence didn't. The same period sees Masonic principles and Enlightenment philosophy spreading through universities where they shape curricula. Banking families with lodge connections consolidate their power through the creation of central banking systems. Scientific institutions, many founded or funded by former lodge members, become the new temples of authority. This is exactly what Weishaupt had written about in his private papers. He understood that you don't need to control a government directly if you can control the institutions that shape how people think. Control the universities and you control what the next generation believes. Control the banks and you control what's possible. Control the scientific establishment and you control what's accepted as truth. The Illuminati didn't need a headquarters or a grandmaster or secret meetings in underground chambers. It had something far more powerful and far more difficult to destroy. It had a philosophy that could inhabit any system of power, could adapt to any political structure, could present itself as progress while serving the same ancient goal of enlightened control by the chosen few. By the mid-1800s, the fears about secret societies have largely faded from public consciousness. The lodges have cleaned up their image. They're now civic organisations, charity groups, fraternal orders where businessmen network. The revolutionary danger has passed, people assume. The threat was exaggerated, they tell themselves. But the networks remain, the philosophy remains, and most importantly, the method remains. The idea that society should be guided by an enlightened elite, that the masses need to be led toward progress rather than allowed to choose their own direction. That knowledge should be parcelled out carefully to those deemed ready for it. This idea becomes embedded in the very structure of modern institutions. It's no longer called the Illuminati. It doesn't need to be. It's simply how things are done. Act 3. From Europe to America, let's return to that dollar bill in your wallet. The Great Seal of the United States, the design that appears on the back, was approved in 1782, just 3 years before the Bavarian Illuminati was officially banned. It was printed on currency starting in 1935, during Franklin Roosevelt's presidency. The reverse side shows that unfinished pyramid with 13 steps, topped by the Eye of Providence radiating light. Below the pyramid, a banner reads Novus Ordo Seclorum, Latin for New Order of the Ages. The traditional explanation is simple. The unfinished pyramid represents America as a work in progress. The eye represents divine oversight, God watching over this new nation. The phrase means that America represents a new chapter in human history, a break from European monarchies. It's all very patriotic and innocent. But let's look at who designed this seal. The final design was influenced by Charles Thompson, Secretary of Congress, who had studied classical languages and symbols. The eye above the pyramid was not a common Christian symbol in 1782. It was, however, identical to imagery used in Enlightenment-era secret societies, including groups that shared philosophy with the Illuminati. Now let's look at the founding figures of America. Benjamin Franklin was a confirmed Freemason, a member of the Lodge of the Nine Sisters in Paris, one of the most influential lodges in Europe. Thomas Jefferson, while not confirmed as a Freemason, corresponded extensively with Enlightenment philosophers and owned one of the largest collections of Enlightenment literature in America. George Washington was a Freemason who was buried with full Masonic honours. These men weren't members of the Bavarian Illuminati specifically. The timing doesn't quite work and the evidence isn't there. But they were intellectual descendants of the same philosophical movement. They read the same books, believed in the same principles of reason over religion, progress over tradition, enlightened leadership over mob rule. The United States was founded on Enlightenment principles. That's not controversial. What conspiracy researchers argue is that these principles came with an embedded architecture of control, a built-in hierarchy that would allow those in the know to guide civilization while maintaining the appearance of democracy. Look at how the American system was actually designed. The Electoral College, which prevents direct democracy in presidential elections. The Senate, which was originally appointed rather than elected. The Supreme Court, with lifetime appointments and no accountability to voters. These weren't accidents or compromises. They were intentional barriers against what the founders called the tyranny of the majority, which is another way of saying they didn't trust common people to make important decisions. This is the core Illuminati principle, dressed in the language of republicanism. Let people vote, but control what they can vote for. Let people speak, but control what they hear. Create the appearance of freedom while maintaining elite guidance at the critical junctions of power. The seal on the dollar bill isn't just a symbol of America, it's a mission statement. A new order is rising, built on the foundations of secret knowledge, guided by those who understand the true nature of power. The pyramid is unfinished because the work continues. The eye watches because the enlightened must always observe and adjust. The phrase declares that this represents a break from the past, a new way of organising human society, a pyramid of power, a hidden eye, a new order rising, not in Bavaria anymore, but in America, the nation that would come to dominate the 20th century and export its systems to the entire world. Act 4. The 20th Century Resurgence. 2 world wars reshaped civilization in ways that were unimaginable in previous centuries. Empires that existed for hundreds of years collapse in a matter of years. Tens of millions die. The survivors wake up to a world where the old structures of power, the monarchies and colonial systems and religious authorities no longer function. Into this vacuum step new institutions with a new promise. Instead of competing nations causing war, we'll have international cooperation ensuring peace. Instead of economic chaos, we'll have coordinated financial systems. Instead of ignorance and nationalism, we'll have global education and shared values. The League of Nations forms after World War I. It fails, but the idea doesn't die. After World War II, the United Nations rises in its place, this time with real power, real funding, and a permanent home in New York City. Around the same time, the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944 creates the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, institutions that will shape global economics for the rest of the century. Each of these organisations represents a concentration of authority. Instead of hundreds of nations making independent decisions, now there are forums where a smaller number of representatives can coordinate action. Instead of thousands of banks operating independently, now there are central systems that can influence all of them. This is exactly how a hidden elite would manage global control, according to declassified documents from the Office of Strategic Services, the predecessor to the CIA. These memos, released decades later through Freedom of Information Act requests, reference supranational influence networks and the importance of creating institutions that operate above national sovereignty. The language is bureaucratic, but the meaning is clear. The people designing the post-war world understood that direct control of governments is inefficient and unstable. It's better to create systems that governments must operate within, systems that appear neutral but are actually designed to produce specific outcomes. By the 1970s, this process accelerates. David Rockefeller, whose family name appears repeatedly in conspiracy theories for good reason, establishes the Trilateral Commission in 1973 with Zbigniew Brzezinski, who would become National Security Advisor under President Carter. The stated purpose is to foster cooperation between North America, Europe and Japan. The unstated purpose, according to critics, is to create a private forum where the most powerful people in the world can coordinate policy without public oversight. Around the same time, though it started earlier in 1954, the Bilderberg Group holds annual conferences that bring together world leaders, CEOs of the largest corporations, heads of major banks and selected intellectuals. These meetings happen at luxury hotels in different countries each year. No press is allowed, no transcripts are released, no minutes are published. Attendees are told not to discuss what happens inside. The official explanation is that this secrecy allows for frank discussion without grandstanding. People can speak honestly if they know it won't be quoted in tomorrow's newspapers. It's like Davos or any other international conference, they say, just networking at a high level. But here's what makes conspiracy researchers pay attention. First, the attendee list reads like a directory of global power. Second, the same names appear at Bilderberg, the Trilateral Commission, the Council on Foreign Relations, the World Economic Forum, and the boards of the most influential banks and corporations. Third, decisions that are discussed at these meetings often become policy a few months or years later, suggesting that what happens in these rooms isn't just talk, it's coordination. They call it coordination, others call it control. The question that no one in authority will answer directly is control by whom, and for what purpose. Act 5. The Modern Network. The 1990s bring a transformation in how power operates. The Soviet Union collapses, ending the Cold War and leaving America as the sole superpower. Global finance, enabled by new technology, begins to move trillions of dollars across borders at the speed of light. Mass media consolidates into a handful of corporations that own most of what people see and hear. The internet emerges, promising democratic access to information, but quickly being shaped by the same forces that controlled previous technologies. This is when conspiracy theories about the Illuminati explode into popular culture. Books like Behold a Pale Horse and The New World Order become underground bestsellers. Radio shows dedicated to exposing secret societies gain millions of listeners. The internet allows researchers to share documents, connect patterns, and build a collective case that something systematic is happening behind the official story. What they notice are recurring overlaps in membership between the organisations we've discussed. The Council on Foreign Relations, founded in 1921, includes members who are also part of the Trilateral Commission and attend Bilderberg meetings. These same individuals sit on the boards of major banks like Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan Chase. They advise presidents from both political parties. They run the Federal Reserve. They fund think tanks that produce the policy papers that become legislation. Certain family names appear again and again across generations. Rockefeller, one of the wealthiest dynasties in American history, with foundations, banks and politicians across multiple generations. Rothschild, the banking family that financed European governments for 2 centuries. Windsor, the British royal family. Bush, 2 presidents and a lineage of intelligence connections going back to World War II. This doesn't prove conspiracy by itself. Wealthy families stay wealthy. Power tends to concentrate. People with similar backgrounds tend to know each other, but the pattern is undeniable, and it matches exactly what you would expect if Weishaupt's vision had succeeded. An interconnected network of families and institutions, each piece appearing independent, but all moving in the same general direction towards centralised control, disguised as necessary coordination. Then something stranger happens. Corporate marketing and entertainment industries begin deliberately using Illuminati symbolism. Music videos feature pyramids, all-seeing eyes, and occult imagery. Award shows stage elaborate rituals that reference secret societies. Fashion lines incorporate symbols that used to be hidden, but are now displayed openly. At first, researchers assume this is confirmation. These celebrities must be members. The corporations must be controlled. The symbols are signals of allegiance. But there's another interpretation, one that's actually more disturbing. What if the symbols are being used to defang the whole concept? What if making Illuminati imagery trendy and commercial is itself a form of disinformation? When Beyoncé forms a triangle with her hands, is she signalling membership in a secret order, or is she participating in marketing that makes the whole idea seem like entertainment? When rebellion becomes a brand, it ceases to be rebellion. When conspiracy becomes fashion, it stops being taken seriously. This is a sophisticated form of control, and it's far more effective than trying to hide. You don't need to suppress dangerous ideas if you can turn them into merchandise. The theories link artists like Jay-Z, Kanye West, Madonna and Beyoncé to secret initiation and hidden allegiance. Maybe some of those theories are true. Maybe these artists have connections to powerful networks, or maybe they're just using provocative imagery because it sells records and gets attention, and in doing so, they're providing cover for the actual networks of power that operate in boardrooms and private conferences, not in music videos. This is the genius of modern control. Everything is out in the open, but arranged in such a way that you can't tell what's real and what's performance. The symbols are everywhere, which means they're nowhere. The secrets are spoken about constantly, which means they're not secrets. And anyone who tries to connect the dots gets dismissed as seeing patterns in randomness, even though the patterns are objectively there in the historical record. Act 6. The Information Age. The 21st century brings something that Weishaupt could never have imagined, but would have absolutely recognised as the perfection of his vision. Digital technology creates the possibility of total information awareness, the ability to monitor what everyone sees, says and does, not through crude surveillance but through the willing participation of billions of people who carry tracking devices everywhere they go. For a while, this seems like paranoid fantasy. Then WikiLeaks begins publishing classified documents that prove governments and corporations are doing exactly what conspiracy theorists claimed. Edward Snowden reveals that the National Security Agency is collecting data on virtually every electronic communication in the world. Cambridge Analytica shows how social media data can be weaponized to manipulate elections. These aren't theories, these are documented facts, proven through leaked documents and whistleblower testimony. Information control is real. Narrative management is real. Surveillance is real. The debate is no longer whether these things are happening, but whether they're justified. This is where conspiracy researchers point out something crucial. This is precisely how a secret order would function in the modern age. Not by commanding armies or assassinating leaders, though those tools remain available when needed, but by shaping thought, by controlling what information people see, by nudging behaviour through algorithm design, by making certain ideas seem ridiculous and other ideas seem inevitable. You don't need to force people to comply if you can manipulate them into wanting what you want them to want. You don't need to ban books if you can bury them under an avalanche of content that says the opposite. You don't need secret meetings if you can coordinate through encrypted channels that look like normal business communication. The phrase Illuminati confirmed becomes a meme, a joke that people post when they see yet another celebrity covering one eye or another corporate logo with a pyramid. It's meant to be ironic, pointing out how silly these conspiracy theories are. But in making it a joke, in turning the concept into entertainment, it serves a purpose. It makes serious investigation seem foolish. It defangs the subject by turning it into content. This might be the most perfect act of disinformation ever achieved. The best way to hide a secret society is to convince everyone it's a joke, to make the idea so associated with paranoid nonsense that serious researchers won't touch it, journalists won't investigate it, and anyone who tries to connect documented facts gets lumped in with people claiming lizard aliens run the government. Meanwhile, the actual concentration of power continues. A handful of corporations own most media companies. A handful of banks control most financial flows. A handful of tech companies mediate most human communication. A handful of individuals meeting at invitation-only conferences coordinate policy that affects billions of people who never voted for them and don't know their names. This isn't hidden. It's documented. You can look up the board members. You can see the connections. The information is available. But it's arranged in such a way that pointing it out makes you sound crazy, even though it's objectively true. Act 7. The evidence of connection. Let's look at specific documents that connect the dots between historical secret societies and modern power structures. These aren't theories. These are papers you can request through government archives. Declassified correspondence between Alan Dulles, who directed the CIA during the Cold War, and Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands, who founded the Bilderberg Group, shows discussions about post-war cultural steering. The phrase appears multiple times. Cultural steering, not military control or economic policy, but the deliberate shaping of what people think and believe. Files released through Freedom of Information Act requests reveal that intelligence agencies funded art movements, music festivals, magazines, and academic programs through front organisations. The Congress for Cultural Freedom, funded by the CIA, sponsored abstract expressionist art because it was seen as promoting individualism against Soviet collectivism. Similar programs funded jazz tours, literary magazines, and university symposiums. Why does this matter? Because it's exactly the method Weishaupt described in his papers. You don't control society through force. You control it through culture. You shape what people admire, what they aspire to, what they consider sophisticated, and what they consider backward. You fund the artists and intellectuals who say what you want said. You publish the books that promote your vision. You make your ideology seem like the natural progression of civilization. The continuity is striking when you look at it chronologically. 18th century Illuminism promoted Enlightenment rationalism and elite guidance. 20th century secret diplomacy promoted international institutions and coordinated policy. 21st century digital governance promotes algorithmic management and data-driven decision-making. Different vocabulary, different tools, same underlying principle. Humanity needs to be guided by those who know better. Democracy is fine for local matters, but the big decisions require expertise that most people don't have. Freedom is important, but it must be balanced against order. Transparency is a nice idea, but some things must remain secret for the greater good. You can find this argument made explicitly in documents from the Trilateral Commission, particularly in The Crisis of Democracy, a report from 1975 that argues democratic governments are becoming ungovernable because people have too many demands and not enough deference to authority. The solution proposed is not more democracy, but better management of expectations, which is a polite way of saying manipulation of what people think they want. This is the smoking gun that conspiracy researchers point to. Not a confession of being the Illuminati, not a secret handshake caught on camera, but a consistent philosophical thread running from Weishaupt's banned society to the most powerful institutions of the modern world. The belief that society must be managed by an elite who understand the big picture while the masses are kept comfortable but controlled. Maybe there's no underground cabal signing contracts in candlelight. Maybe there's no Grand Master issuing orders from a hidden temple. Maybe the Illuminati doesn't need a headquarters or a ritual or a membership card. Maybe it succeeded so completely that we're living inside it, and we call it civilization. EXT8, the convergence theory. This is where we need to step back and look at the bigger pattern. Conspiracy researchers have developed what they call the convergence theory, which attempts to explain how the Illuminati evolved from a specific organization into a networked ideology. Phase 1 was the Enlightenment era roots, intellectual elitism disguised as humanism, the belief that reason and science, guided by the educated few, should replace religion and tradition. This wasn't inherently sinister. Many Enlightenment thinkers genuinely believed they were liberating humanity. But embedded in this liberation was a hierarchy, a priesthood of the rational that would replace the priesthood of the church. Phase 2 was banking and industrial consolidation. The 19th century saw wealth concentrate into family dynasties that funded governments, built railroads, and controlled resources. The Rothschilds financed European wars. The Rockefellers monopolized oil. The Morgans dominated finance. These families intermarried, sat on each other's boards, and coordinated their interests. They didn't call themselves the Illuminati, but they functioned as a network of mutual advantage that transcended national boundaries. Phase 3 was cultural hegemony in the 20th century. Control shifted from raw economic power to something more sophisticated, the management of what people think and feel. This was achieved through mass media, education systems and entertainment industries that all promoted similar values, celebrated similar heroes, and presented the existing power structure as natural and inevitable, rather than constructed and maintained. Phase 4 is technocratic governance in the 21st century. Control now operates through algorithms, through data analysis, through platforms that mediate human interaction. Google decides what information you find. Facebook decides what news you see. Amazon decides what products you encounter. These decisions are made by code, written by engineers, guided by executives who attend the same conferences and share the same worldview. The torch passed from philosophers to bankers, from bankers to media moguls, from media moguls to tech CEOs. Different people, different industries, different centuries. But the same pursuit of organised control over human civilization, the same belief that the enlightened few must guide the ignorant many, the same methodology of influence that operates behind the facade of freedom. This is why the conspiracy is so difficult to prove or disprove. There's no single organisation to expose. There's no membership list to leak. There's no headquarters to raid. It's a convergence of interests, a shared worldview among people who benefit from the current arrangement of power and have the means to perpetuate it. When you reach this level of analysis, the question of whether the Illuminati exists becomes almost meaningless. The specific organisation from 1776 to 1785 definitely existed, and was definitely shut down. But the philosophy didn't die, it adapted, it spread. It became the default operating system of modern power. ASTI 9, the invisible government. In 2010, Julian Assange, during an interview about WikiLeaks and government secrecy, quoted a phrase from Edward Bernays, the father of modern propaganda and nephew of Sigmund Freud. Bernays wrote in his book Propaganda, published in 1928, and this is a direct quote that appears in the book: "Those who manipulate the unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government which is the true ruling power." Bernays wasn't a conspiracy theorist. He was an advisor to presidents and corporations. He helped engineer the overthrow of the Guatemalan government for the United Fruit Company. He convinced women to smoke cigarettes by associating it with feminism. He understood, better than almost anyone in the 20th century, how to shape public opinion to serve private interests. When he talks about an invisible government, he's describing something real. Not a secret society meeting in shadows, but a network of influence that operates through institutions that appear neutral. Public relations firms, think tanks, advisory councils, academic departments, media organisations, each piece independently owned, but coordinating through shared personnel, funding sources and ideological alignment. This is the government that doesn't appear on ballot papers. The government that persists regardless of which party wins elections. The government that sets the boundaries of acceptable debate, that determines which problems get attention and which get ignored, that guides civilization toward outcomes chosen by people most citizens couldn't name. The phrase New World Order, which has become synonymous with conspiracy theories, was actually popularized by President George H.W. Bush in a speech to Congress on September 11, 1991, exactly 10 years before the date that would become infamous for different reasons. He spoke about the opportunity to build a new world order, a world where the rule of law supplants the rule of the jungle, where nations recognize the shared responsibility for freedom and justice. It sounds noble, but listen to what he's actually saying. Not a world where each nation governs itself, a world where shared responsibility, meaning collective decision-making by international bodies, takes precedence. Not diverse political systems, but the rule of law, meaning a single legal framework. Not competing visions of justice, but a shared definition determined by those who have the power to enforce it. This echoes the same Enlightenment ideal that Weishaupt promoted: global unity through elite coordination, one system, one vision, one set of rules, enforced not through conquest, but through economic pressure. through diplomatic isolation, through the designation of who is civilized and who is rogue. The words change, the rhetoric adapts to the era, but the mission remains: order through control, unity through obedience, light through secrecy. The motto of the original Illuminati, order out of chaos, which they borrowed from Freemasonry, captures the entire project. Create or exploit crisis, then offer order as the solution, order that requires accepting centralized authority. This pattern repeats throughout history. Financial crisis leads to central banking. World wars lead to international institutions. Terrorism leads to surveillance states. Pandemic leads to digital tracking. Each crisis expands the power of coordinating bodies at the expense of local autonomy and individual privacy. Each crisis is presented as unique and demanding unprecedented response, and each response moves in the same direction, toward fewer people making decisions that affect more people. Aced 10. The conclusion. So let's return to the original question. Does the Illuminati exist? Mainstream historians will tell you no. The Bavarian Illuminati was dissolved in 1785. It had 9 years of existence. It was a historical footnote. Everything that came after is conspiracy theory, pattern recognition run amok, the human tendency to see intention in coincidence. Conspiracy researchers will tell you yes, but not in the way most people imagine. The Illuminati succeeded in its goal of creating a rational world led by an enlightened few. It didn't conquer civilization through force. It became civilization by making its principles seem like progress. Both answers are partially correct and entirely misleading. The useful question isn't whether a specific organization exists, but whether power operates the way Weishaupt envisioned. And on that question, the evidence is overwhelming. Every major institution of global governance follows the model of concentrated authority justified as expertise. The International Monetary Fund and World Bank make economic policy that affects billions, but are accountable to a few dozen member nations weighted by wealth. The Federal Reserve makes decisions that shape the entire American economy, but operates independently of democratic oversight. The European Union creates regulations that supersede national law, but is run by commissioners most Europeans couldn't name. Every global summit, every corporate merger, every coordinated crisis response follows the same blueprint. Gather the elite in private settings, determine the proper course of action, implement it through institutions that appear neutral, present it to the public as inevitable and necessary, marginalize dissent as ignorant or dangerous. This isn't hidden. You can watch it happen in real time if you pay attention. The World Economic Forum publishes its agenda openly. The Bilderberg Group lists attendees after each conference. The Council on Foreign Relations posts its policy recommendations online. The Trilateral Commission has a website. None of this is secret in the traditional sense, but it's effectively invisible to most people, because it operates at a level of abstraction that doesn't connect to daily life until the decisions have already been made. By the time a new trade agreement or financial regulation or digital standard affects your life, it's already been decided by people you didn't elect, meeting in places you couldn't attend, based on priorities you didn't set. If Weishaupt's goal was to build a rational world led by the enlightened few, look around, we're living in it. Experts determine what's true. Fact-checkers decide what's misinformation. Platforms moderate what's acceptable. Algorithms curate what's visible. And all of this is presented as neutral, as scientific, as necessary for a functioning complex society. The only question left is whether we were enlightened or simply engineered, whether the progress we've experienced represents genuine liberation or sophisticated control, whether the freedom we believe we have is real or carefully managed. The symbol on the dollar bill stares out from your wallet, that unfinished pyramid with the watching eye, announcing a new order of the ages. Maybe it was just a design choice by committee in 1782, or maybe it was a declaration of intent, a message hidden in plain sight for over 2 centuries, telling anyone willing to look that this nation, and the world it would come to shape, was built on a foundation of enlightened control disguised as democracy. The Illuminati doesn't need to exist as a secret society if its principles have become the structure of civilization itself. The order may have been banned in 1785, but the order it sought to create has been under construction ever since, advancing through crisis and opportunity, adapting to technology and culture, always moving toward the same goal: order out of chaos. That was their motto. Look at the chaos of our current moment, the crises stacking upon each other, each one demanding more coordination, more surveillance, more centralised decision-making, more trust in authorities we didn't choose and can't remove. Look at the order being offered in response, the promise that if we accept the right systems, follow the right experts, adopt the right technologies, everything will be managed correctly. And ask yourself who benefits from that order, who decides what correct management looks like, who sits in those rooms at those conferences making those decisions, whose vision of enlightenment is being built while we're told we're being liberated. The Illuminati wanted to free humanity from superstition, monarchies and religious control. They succeeded. We're free from those things. But we're not free from control itself. It simply changed form, changed language, changed justification. The pyramid is unfinished because the work continues. The eye watches because the enlightened must always observe and guide. And the new order of the ages means that what came before was replaced with something that serves the same function under a different name. Maybe that's progress. Maybe guided evolution of civilization by those who understand complex systems is genuinely better than chaos and conflict. Maybe we do need invisible government because visible government has proven so corrupt and incompetent. Maybe the Illuminati won, and we should be grateful. Or maybe we should remember that every system of control claims to be for our own good. Every reduction of freedom is justified as necessary protection. Every expansion of surveillance is presented as security. And every concentration of power promises it will be used wisely by those who know best. Adam Weishaupt died in 1830, decades after his order was banned. He never saw the world wars or the United Nations or the internet. But if he could see the civilization we've built, with its global institutions and digital networks and algorithmic governance and expert classes making decisions for populations that don't understand and don't question, he might recognize it as the fulfillment of everything he envisioned. We are living in the illuminated age. The question is whether we're the ones who are enlightened, or just the ones being studied under the light. Thank you for watching this investigation. If you found this information valuable, subscribe to support more deep dives into the hidden architecture of power. Leave a comment with your thoughts, but be aware that certain keywords may limit visibility. Share this with someone who needs to see it. And remember, the best way to hide the truth is to make people think they already know it. The symbol on your dollar bill is still watching. It's been watching since 1782, and it will continue watching as long as you keep accepting that it belongs there. An all-seeing eye above an unfinished pyramid, announcing an order built by those who you'll never see, but who see everything you do. Order out of chaos. Their motto. Our reality. The Illuminati doesn't need to exist as a secret society if we're all living inside the world it wanted to create. Stay aware, question authority, follow the money, and never forget that the most powerful conspiracies don't need to hide. They just need to convince you they don't exist. What if the most dangerous secrets aren't hidden in classified files, but buried in plain sight, in the footnotes of forgotten academic papers? What if the government's most classified unit wasn't studying aliens at all, but something far more terrifying? Something that's been manipulating human belief since the dawn of civilization itself? Before we dive into tonight's story, I want to give a shout out to Jeffernan 1772 for suggesting this incredible topic. Your video ideas keep sleep theories going, so please drop your suggestions in the comments below, and if you're enjoying these deep dives into the unknown, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Now let's talk about the Collins Elite, and why they might be the most important government program you've never heard of. I wasn't looking for UFOs, I was looking for a way to pay rent. The gig economy had chewed me up and spit me out more times than I cared to count. Web design, freelance writing, even a brief stint delivering food, nothing stuck. But when Dr. Martinelli at the university offered me work as a research assistant, scanning old theological dissertations for the digital archive, I jumped at it. $25 an hour to sit in a quiet library basement, copying dusty Latin passages and obscure biblical references that nobody had touched in decades. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. The work was mind-numbing mostly. Endless pages of theological debates from the 1950s and 60s, written by seminary students who were probably dead by now. The Augustinian interpretation of angelic hierarchies, post-war perspectives on demonic manifestation, scriptural analysis of divine intervention in modern context. Heavy stuff, but about as exciting as watching paint dry. I'd been at it for 3 months when I found the reference that changed everything. It was October, around 2 a.m. I was halfway through a 1963 thesis titled Angelic Manifestations in Modern Times, 324 pages of dense theological argumentation by a seminarian named Marcus Whitmore. The kind of paper that made me question every life choice that had led me to that basement. I was scanning page 187, a particularly dry section about contemporary witness testimony, when a footnote caught my eye. It wasn't the content that stopped me, it was the context. The main text was discussing reports of luminous beings witnessed by various clergy members throughout the 1950s. Standard religious stuff, the kind of mystical experiences that show up in seminary papers all the time. But the footnote read, "For governmental perspective on similar phenomena, see Collins Elite Memorandum 1957, classification status unknown." I stared at that line for a full minute. It was cited like a real source, with the matter-of-fact tone of academic reference. No explanation, no context, just there. The problem was, this wasn't a section about government or politics. It was about angels. And the thesis was written by a seminary student, not a political science major. So why was he referencing what sounded like a classified government document in the middle of a paper about divine manifestations? I made a note and kept scanning, but the reference nagged at me. Collins Elite. It sounded official, maybe military. But why would a religious scholar in 1963 have access to classified material? And why would he cite it so casually, as if his readers would know what he was talking about? The next day, I couldn't concentrate on my assigned documents. Instead, I found myself searching the university's digital catalogue for any mention of Collins Elite. Nothing came up in the main database, but I had access to some of the restricted theological archives through Dr. Martinelli's login credentials. That's where I found the second reference. It was in a 1959 lecture transcript from a Catholic seminary in Maryland. The speaker was Father Benedict Toretti, discussing unusual spiritual encounters in the post-war era. Most of the lecture was standard theological fare, but near the end, during what appeared to be an informal Q&A session, someone asked about government interest in religious phenomena. Father Toretti's response was brief but loaded. There are those in Washington who understand that not all mysteries can be solved with science. The Collins Elite represents a different approach to certain questions, but we must be careful not to mistake understanding for wisdom or documentation for truth. The transcript noted uncomfortable silence after this comment, and the lecture ended shortly thereafter. 2 references, 2 religious contexts, both suggesting that Collins' Elite was some kind of government program dealing with spiritual or supernatural phenomena. But why were religious scholars the only ones talking about it? And why did they all seem nervous about it? I spent the rest of the week diving deeper into the theological archives. The pattern that emerged was both fascinating and disturbing. Collins' Elite didn't show up in UFO journals or conspiracy magazines. It didn't appear in scientific papers or military histories. Instead, it haunted the footnotes of religious documents like a ghost that only clergy could see. A 1958 exorcism report from a priest in New Mexico mentioned consultation with Collins' Elite regarding non-terrestrial influences. A 1962 seminary paper on demonic deception in the modern age included a cryptic reference to Collins' Elite protocols for distinguishing spiritual from extraplanetary phenomena. A 1961 lecture on comparative religion contained a single chilling line. As the Collins Elite has documented, the same entities that once appeared as gods now masquerade as visitors from the stars. Each reference was brief, almost coded, like the authors were speaking to an audience that would understand the implications without needing explanation. And always, the references appeared in contexts dealing with the supernatural, the spiritual, the otherworldly, but never in the way you'd expect. These weren't discussions of government cover-ups or alien conspiracies. They were warnings, theological warnings about deception, about false prophets, about entities that wore whatever mask humanity was willing to believe. I was starting to get a picture of something much stranger than a typical black project. Collins' Elite wasn't studying UFOs the way the Air Force was. They were studying them the way the Catholic Church studied demons. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, a misfiled document. I was scanning a collection of 1964 seminary papers when I found something that didn't belong. Mixed in with discussions of Vatican II reforms and modern catechism was a single-page document that looked nothing like the others. It was typed on official letterhead, something called Interdenominational Council on Anomalous Phenomena, and dated March 15th, 1959. The document was brief. Memo. Regarding recent Collins Elite Briefing 2, member institutions from Council Secretary following last week's presentation by Dr. Edward Collins regarding non-corporeal intelligence manifestations. The Council recommends the following protocols for clergy encountering anomalous phenomena. Do not assume extraterrestrial origin 2. Apply traditional discernment practices 3. Document all encounters per Collins Elite Guidelines 4. Report suspected deception campaigns immediately. Remember, the same entities that demanded worship as Baal and Moloch now request our trust as benevolent space brothers. The mask changes, the deception remains constant. Father Michael Torino, Council Secretary. My hands were shaking as I read it. This wasn't just a reference to Collins Elite. This was evidence of direct collaboration between the program and religious institutions. They were briefing clergy on how to handle UFO encounters, but from a theological perspective. And that last paragraph, it was suggesting that UFO entities weren't aliens at all. They were something much older and more dangerous, masquerading as extraterrestrials just as they had once masqueraded as ancient gods. I photographed the document with my phone and started digging into this interdenominational council. What I found made my blood run cold. The Interdenominational Council on Anomalous Phenomena existed from 1957 to 1969, according to what little I could find. Its membership included representatives from major Christian denominations, Jewish religious authorities, and even some Islamic scholars. The council was supposedly formed to coordinate religious response to unusual phenomena in the post-war era. That was the official line anyway. The reality appeared to be much more specific. I found meeting minutes from 1958 that discussed the Collins Elite presentation on entity communication patterns. A 1960 report mentioned successful implementation of Collins Elite discernment protocols in 17 states. A 1962 memorandum warned of increased entity activity coinciding with popular UFO narratives. The council wasn't just studying religious phenomena in general, they were specifically focused on what they called entity encounters, and they were working directly with Collins' elite to develop responses. The most disturbing document I found was a 1961 report titled Spiritual Warfare in the Space Age. It outlined what the council believed to be a deliberate deception campaign by non-human entities. Historical analysis suggests consistent behavioural patterns across millennia. Entities appearing as divine beings in ancient times demanded worship, sacrifice, and absolute obedience. Modern manifestations as space visitors request trust, cooperation, and technological exchange. The underlying objective, human subjugation, remains unchanged. The report went on to detail specific cases where UFO contactees had reported entities claiming to be from various star systems, but whose messages contained elements identical to ancient religious texts describing demonic deception. According to the council's analysis, the entities were running the same con they'd always run. They just updated their costumes for each era. As I dug deeper into the council's documents, I started to notice something unsettling. My research wasn't going unnoticed. It started small. Dr. Martinelli mentioned that someone had been asking about my work. Just routine monitoring, he said, but he looked uncomfortable about it. Then I noticed that some of the documents I'd photographed were being moved to different sections of the archive. Files that had been easily accessible suddenly required special permission to view. The final warning came on a Tuesday night in November. I was alone in the archive basement scanning a particularly interesting 1963 document about Collins Elite Field Operations, when my computer screen flickered. The document disappeared, replaced by a simple text message. "Stop looking, they're not what you think." I stared at the screen, heart pounding. Someone was monitoring my research in real time. Someone with access to the university's network, and probably a lot more than that. I should have stopped then. Any reasonable person would have backed off, found a different job, maybe moved to a different city. But I wasn't reasonable anymore. I was obsessed, and besides, whoever was watching had just confirmed that I was onto something real. I replied by typing into the same text box that had appeared on my screen. "Then what are they?" The response came immediately. "They've worn every mask we've ever worshipped." The screen flickered again, and the message disappeared. But the implication was crystal clear. Collins' elite wasn't just studying UFO entities. They'd concluded that these entities were the same beings that had manipulated human religious belief throughout history. Ancient gods, modern aliens, same entities, different costumes. After the warning, access to documents became nearly impossible. Files went missing. Archives were suddenly under renovation. Dr. Martinelli stopped returning my emails. It was clear that my research had triggered some kind of response from whoever wanted Collins' elite to remain buried. But I'd already seen enough to piece together the broad outline of their doctrine. Collins' elite appeared to be a small classified unit within the US government that approached the UFO phenomenon from a religious rather than scientific perspective. Based on the scattered evidence I'd found, their core beliefs seemed to be UFO entities were not extraterrestrial visitors. They were the same non-corporeal beings that had interacted with humans throughout history. These entities had consistently masqueraded as whatever humans were most likely to worship or trust. Their ultimate goal was the spiritual subjugation of humanity. The modern UFO phenomenon was simply their latest deception campaign. The unit apparently worked closely with religious leaders to develop protocols for identifying and resisting entity influence. They studied religious texts not for historical interest, but for tactical intelligence about entity behaviour patterns. They viewed exorcists and clergy as frontline personnel in a spiritual war that most people didn't even know was happening. Most disturbing of all, they seemed to believe they were losing. My research into Collins' elite had taken nearly 6 months, and by December I was running out of leads. The documents had dried up, my access was severely restricted, and I was starting to wonder if I'd ever find anything more concrete than footnotes and oblique references. That's when I decided to look at modern UFO phenomena through the Collins Elite lens. What I found was terrifying in its consistency. Contemporary UFO contactee reports, when examined from a religious perspective, showed the same patterns that Collins Elite had apparently identified in the 1950s. Entities claiming to be from Zeta Reticuli, or the Pleiades, but whose messages contained elements identical to ancient Gnostic texts. Space brothers, preaching salvation through technological advancement, using language that echoed Mesopotamian religious propaganda. Abduction experiences that followed the same psychological patterns as historical demonic possession cases. The modern UFO disclosure movement, viewed through Collins Elite's framework, looked less like a quest for scientific truth and more like the latest phase of an ancient deception campaign. Entities that had once demanded worship as gods now requested trust as benevolent aliens. Same control mechanisms, updated for a scientific age. I started to understand why Collins Elite had worked so closely with religious authorities. If you believe that UFO entities were actually spiritual beings with thousands of years of experience in manipulating human belief systems, then scientists and military analysts were the wrong people to study them. You needed theologians. You needed people who understood the long history of spiritual deception and the psychological mechanisms of faith. You needed people who could recognize the same lie being told with new words. I thought I'd reached the end of my research when I received an unexpected email in January. The sender was listed as archive.recovery@gmail.com, obviously a throwaway account. The message was brief. You've been asking the right questions. Room 847, basement level manuscript collection. Look behind the Milton volumes. 1 hour only. I almost deleted it. Every instinct told me it was a trap, but the Collins Elite investigation had become an obsession, and I couldn't walk away from what might be my last chance at finding real answers. An hour later, I was in the basement of the manuscript collection, a building I'd never visited before. Room 847 was a cramped storage room filled with old books and filing cabinets. The Milton volumes were easy to find, a complete set of Paradise Lost editions dating back to the 1800s. Behind the books, taped to the back of the shelf, was a manila envelope. Inside was a single document that changed everything I thought I knew about Collins Elite. It was typed on official US government letterhead, dated August 12, 1969, and marked Eyes Only Collins Elite Termination Report. The document was brief but explosive. Memorandum for the record subject, termination of Collins Elite program. Effective immediately. All Collins Elite operations are suspended indefinitely. Program termination follows unanimous recommendation by Collins Elite senior staff. Reason for termination: successful entity infiltration of program hierarchy. Evidence suggests long-term entity influence over program direction since 1961. Collins Elite conclusions regarding entity nature remain valid. However, program itself has been compromised beyond recovery. All Collins Elite personnel are reassigned. All documents classified at highest levels. Religious community partnerships terminated. Interdenominational council dissolved. Public disclosure of Collins Elite findings is prohibited under national security provisions. Final assessment: the entities we sought to understand and counter have proven more sophisticated than anticipated. They have successfully used our own investigation against us, turning our knowledge into a tool for their agenda. The Collins Elite program has become part of the deception we were created to expose. Any future investigation of these phenomena must proceed under the assumption that traditional government and academic institutions are compromised. Minus Dr. Edward Collins, Program Director. I read the document 3 times before the implications sank in. Collins Elite hadn't just been terminated because of budget cuts or bureaucratic reshuffling. It had been terminated because the entities they were studying had infiltrated and co-opted the program itself. The Watchers had been turned into accomplices, and if that was true in 1969, what did it mean for every government UFO program since then? Sitting in that storage room, holding what might be the last authentic Collins Elite document ever created, I finally understood the true scope of what I'd uncovered. Collins' elite hadn't been a fringe program run by religious zealots. It had been a serious government investigation that reached a conclusion so disturbing that the entities being studied had been forced to destroy it. The program had gotten too close to the truth, so the truth had destroyed the program. But what was that truth? Based on everything I'd found, Collins' elite had concluded that the UFO phenomenon was not extraterrestrial contact, but rather the latest phase of an ancient psychological operation. Non-corporeal entities, call them demons, call them interdimensional beings, call them whatever you want, had been manipulating human belief systems for millennia. They had appeared as gods to ancient peoples, demanding worship and sacrifice. They had manifested as angels and devils to medieval societies, shaping religious doctrine. And now they were appearing as alien visitors to a technological civilization, promoting their agenda through the language of science and space exploration. The genius of it was that each generation thought they were encountering something new. Ancient peoples saw divine visitation, medieval believers saw spiritual manifestation, modern witnesses see extraterrestrial contact. But according to Collins' elite, it was always the same entities, always running the same basic deception, always working toward the same goal, the spiritual and psychological subjugation of humanity. The entities had realized that direct worship was no longer feasible in a scientific age, so they had adapted, presenting themselves as technologically advanced aliens who could offer humanity salvation through scientific advancement. Instead of demanding worship, they requested trust. Instead of requiring sacrifice, they asked for cooperation. But the underlying dynamic remained the same, humans giving up their autonomy to beings who claimed to have their best interests at heart. And if Collins' elite was right, the modern UFO disclosure movement was simply the latest phase of this deception campaign. The termination document explained why I'd never heard of Collins' elite in any mainstream UFO research. It wasn't being covered up by the government to hide alien contact. It was being covered up because the government itself had been compromised by the entities Collins' elite was studying. Think about it. Every major government UFO program since Collins' elite, Project Blue Book, AA-TIP, the UAP Task Force, had approached the phenomenon from a purely technological perspective. They studied craft capabilities, flight patterns, potential propulsion systems. They never asked the questions Collins' elite had been asking. What do these entities actually want? Why do their messages always promote dependence rather than independence? Why do their promises of enlightenment always require surrender of human agency? Those questions weren't being ignored by accident. According to the termination document, they were being actively suppressed by entities who had learned to work within government and academic institutions. The modern UFO research community, the disclosure advocates, the scientists studying anomalous aerial phenomena, they might all be sincere in their efforts, but they were asking the wrong questions. They were looking for extraterrestrial contact when they should have been looking for spiritual deception. And that meant that every major UFO revelation of the past 50 years might actually be part of the deception Collins' elite had tried to expose. I left that storage room with more questions than answers, but one thing was crystal clear. Collins' elite had tried to warn us, and we hadn't listened. Worse, we might not be capable of listening, because the entities they warned us about had apparently learned to control the conversation. Over the following weeks, I tried to verify the termination document through official channels. I filed Freedom of Information Act requests. I contacted government historians. I reached out to former intelligence officials. The responses were universally the same. No record of any program called Collins' Elite existed in official government files. But that didn't mean the program had never existed. It just meant that someone had been very thorough in erasing it. The more I thought about it, the more the Collins' Elite scenario made sense of things that had always bothered me about the UFO phenomenon. Why did entity messages always promote technological dependence rather than spiritual development? Why did alien contact always require humans to abandon their traditional belief systems? Why did every promised revelation turn out to be just another layer of mystery? According to Collins' Elite, it was because the entities weren't trying to enlighten us. They were trying to control us. and the best way to control a technologically advanced species was to convince them that salvation could only come through higher technology, provided by beings who claimed to have humanity's best interests at heart, the ancient formula updated for a scientific age. After finding the termination document, I thought my Collins Elite investigation was over, but 2 weeks later I received another cryptic email from the same archive. Recovery account. You found the termination report. Good. Now find the real archive. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, Georgetown University Theology Department. Tell her Marcus sent you. I almost ignored it. The rational part of my brain was screaming that I was already in too deep, that whoever was feeding me information might be leading me into something dangerous. But the name Marcus rang a bell. Marcus Whitmore, the author of that first 1963 thesis where I'd found the Collins Elite reference. Could he still be alive? Dr. Rodriguez's office was in a converted Victorian house on the Georgetown campus, tucked between the main theology building and an old chapel. When I mentioned that Marcus had sent me, her reaction was immediate and alarming. She locked her office door, closed the blinds, and pulled out a device I later learned was a radio frequency detector. 62 years, she said quietly, sweeping the device around the room. 62 years Marcus has been waiting for someone to follow the trail far enough to find him. He's 91 years old and still afraid they're listening. Dr. Rodriguez led me through a maze of basement corridors beneath the theology building to a climate-controlled storage room I never could have found on my own. Inside, Marcus Whitmore sat surrounded by filing cabinets that looked like they'd been moved there decades ago. He was ancient, but his eyes were sharp and alert. "You're the one asking about Collins Elite," he said. It wasn't a question. "Eleanor tells me you found the termination report. That means they decided you were ready." They? The survivors. The ones who got out before the infiltration was complete. He gestured to the filing cabinets around us. "We've been maintaining our own archive for over 50 years. Everything the government tried to bury, we preserved. What Marcus showed me over the next 6 hours changed everything I thought I knew about Collins Elite, and about the scope of the deception they had uncovered. Collins Elite hadn't begun as a government program at all. It had started in 1947 as an informal network of military officers, intelligence analysts and religious scholars who were disturbed by early UFO reports. What bothered them wasn't the craft themselves, but the messages being delivered by the entities inside them. The contactee movement was just getting started, Marcus explained, pulling out files from the late 1940s. George Adamski, Daniel Fry, Truman Bethurum, all these people claiming contact with benevolent space brothers. But when you analysed their messages from a theological perspective, they weren't promoting human spiritual development. They were promoting dependence. The early Collins Elite had conducted detailed analyses of contactee messages and found disturbing patterns. The entities consistently promoted several key themes: the inadequacy of human religion, the necessity of technological advancement, the benefits of surrendering human decision-making to superior beings, and the dangers of independent spiritual development. It was the same psychological framework used by every cult in history, Dr. Rodriguez added. Isolate the subject from their support systems, convince them that traditional sources of guidance are inadequate, then position yourself as the only reliable source of truth. But Collins Elite's analysis went deeper than simple cult mechanics. They had identified specific linguistic and conceptual patterns that appeared across different contactee cases, patterns that matched historical accounts of demonic deception dating back thousands of years. Marcus showed me a 1952 analysis comparing Adamski's alleged conversations with Venusian beings to transcripts from 16th century witch trials. The parallels were undeniable. The same promises of secret knowledge, the same dismissal of conventional morality, the same emphasis on the chosen status of the contactee. That's when we knew we were dealing with something ancient, Marcus said. These weren't aliens from space. They were the same entities that had been manipulating human belief systems since the beginning of recorded history. By 1957, Collins Elite had attracted official government attention. The CIA and military intelligence was struggling to understand the UFO phenomenon from a technological perspective, but Collins Elite was approaching it from an entirely different angle, and getting results. We could predict contactee behaviour patterns, Dr. Rodriguez explained. We could identify which cases were likely to be genuine entity contact versus hoaxes or psychological episodes. We could even predict what messages the entities would deliver in future contacts. This predictive ability had made Collins Elite invaluable to government agencies dealing with UFO incidents. But it had also made them a target. Marcus pulled out a thick file labelled Entity Response Patterns, 1958 to 1961. Inside were dozens of reports documenting how UFO activity and contactee experiences changed in response to Collins Elite investigations. Whenever we got too close to exposing their methods, they would shift tactics, Marcus said. Study their linguistic patterns too closely, and suddenly contactees would start receiving messages in completely different styles. Document their technological claims, and they would start demonstrating entirely different capabilities. The entities weren't just running a deception campaign, they were actively monitoring the investigators and adapting their approach in real time. But the most disturbing pattern was personal targeting. Collins Elite members began experiencing their own anomalous encounters, but these experiences were clearly designed to discredit or manipulate the investigators, rather than provide genuine contact. Dr. Edward Collins himself was contacted in 1960, Marcus revealed. The entity claimed to be from Rigel and offered to provide him with advanced technology in exchange for shutting down the Collins Elite program. When he refused, the encounters became increasingly threatening. Other Collins Elite members reported similar experiences, contact attempts that seemed designed to either co-opt them or drive them out of the program entirely. The entities were fighting back. The termination document I'd found told only part of the story. The real disaster began in 1961 when Collins Elite was formally incorporated into the government's UFO investigation apparatus. That was our mistake, Marcus said bitterly. We thought official recognition would give us more resources, better access to witness testimony, protection from entity retaliation. Instead, it gave them access to us. With official status came new personnel assignments, government oversight, and integration with other classified programs. Collins Elite's small, tight-knit network of trusted researchers was suddenly flooded with new members whose backgrounds couldn't be thoroughly vetted. The infiltration was subtle at first, Dr. Rodriguez explained. New analysts who would subtly shift the focus of investigations, administrative personnel who would lose crucial documents, supervisors who would redirect resources toward more promising lines of inquiry. By 1965, original Collins Elite members were reporting that their research conclusions were being systematically altered before reaching higher-level officials. Analyses emphasizing the deceptive nature of entity contact were being rewritten to focus on potential technological benefits. Warnings about spiritual manipulation were being deleted entirely. Marcus showed me internal memos from 1966 to 1968, documenting the growing suspicion among original Collins Elite members that their program had been compromised. They began conducting parallel investigations using secure channels, trying to determine whether the infiltration was the result of foreign intelligence operations, bureaucratic incompetence, or something more sinister. By 1968, we had our answer, Marcus said grimly. It was the entities themselves. They had learned to work through human intermediaries, people who might not even be consciously aware that they were being influenced. The evidence was subtle but damning. New Collins Elite personnel consistently made decisions that served entity interests, redirecting investigations away from deception analysis, promoting contactees who delivered pro-entity messages, suppressing research that exposed manipulation tactics. The final proof came when Dr. Collins tried to present his findings to the Defense Intelligence Agency in 1969, Dr. Rodriguez said. His presentation was completely rewritten between the time he submitted it and the time it was delivered. Instead of warning about entity deception, it recommended increased cooperation with UFO intelligences. That was when the original Collins Elite members realized their program had been completely subverted. The Watchers had become the Watched, and the Watched had become the Watchers. Rather than fight a battle they couldn't win within government channels, the original Collins Elite members made a radical decision. They would fake the program's termination while secretly continuing their research through private channels. The termination report you found was genuine, Marcus explained, but it wasn't the end of Collins' elite. It was the beginning of the real investigation. Using their existing contacts within religious institutions, academia and government, the Collins elite survivors established a covert network for continuing their research. They couldn't publish their findings or seek official recognition, but they could continue gathering evidence and developing their understanding of the entity deception campaign. "We've been operating continuously for over 50 years, Dr. Rodriguez said, documenting entity activity, analysing their evolving strategies, tracking their infiltration of various institutions. The underground Collins elite had identified several key developments since 1969. The entities had largely abandoned individual contactee operations in favour of influencing institutions directly. Rather than delivering messages through isolated individuals who could be easily dismissed, they were now working through respected scientists, government officials and religious leaders. They had also shifted their primary narrative from spiritual enlightenment to technological salvation. Instead of promising cosmic consciousness or spiritual advancement, they were now focusing on environmental solutions, clean energy, and space exploration. Most significantly, they had begun preparing for mass disclosure rather than gradual revelation. The underground Collins elite believed this represented the final phase of a deception campaign that had been in development for decades. Marcus and Dr. Rodriguez walked me through 50 years of documented entity influence on human institutions. The pattern was consistent but sophisticated. Entities never directly controlled human behaviour, but they influenced it through carefully orchestrated synchronicities, technological inspirations, and strategic information releases. "Look at the development of computer technology," Dr. Rodriguez said, showing me files documenting unusual technological leaps in electronics and computing since the 1960s. Every major breakthrough happened shortly after UFO encounters involving personnel who were in positions to influence research directions. The entities weren't providing blueprints or direct technological assistance. Instead, they were inspiring specific lines of research, guiding human scientists toward discoveries that served long-term entity interests. The internet, social media, artificial intelligence, all of these technologies have made humanity more connected but also more controllable, Marcus observed. They've created systems that can monitor and influence human behaviour on a global scale. According to underground Collins elite analysis, the entities had been systematically encouraging the development of technologies that would make mass psychological manipulation easier, while simultaneously making individual privacy and independence more difficult. But the most disturbing revelation was their analysis of the modern UFO disclosure movement itself. Every major disclosure advocate, every government whistleblower, every scientist calling for serious UFO research, we've documented anomalous encounters in their backgrounds, Dr. Rodriguez said. They're not consciously working for the entities, but they're all promoting the same basic narrative, that UFO contact is inevitable, beneficial, and should be embraced rather than resisted. The underground Collins elite had identified specific psychological themes being promoted through disclosure advocates: the inadequacy of human civilization, the necessity of outside intervention, the benefits of technological advancement over spiritual development, and the dangers of resistance to contact. It's the same message the contactees were delivering in the 1950s, Marcus said, just delivered through more credible sources and backed by more sophisticated evidence. According to the underground Collins elite's analysis, the current disclosure campaign was preparation for something unprecedented: open entity contact with humanity as a whole, rather than selected individuals. They've spent 70 years testing human responses, refining their approach, identifying the most effective manipulation strategies, Dr. Rodriguez explained. Now they're ready to scale up. The evidence they showed me was circumstantial but compelling. Government UFO programs consistently focused on technological aspects while ignoring behavioural and psychological elements. Scientific studies of anomalous phenomena emphasised physical measurements, while dismissing witness testimony about entity motivations. Media coverage promoted wonder and excitement about potential contact, while discouraging analysis of entity intentions. They're engineering consent, Marcus said, creating a cultural context where open contact will be seen as humanity's graduation to a higher level of existence rather than submission to a superior intelligence. The underground Collins elite believed that formal contact would be presented as humanity's invitation to join a galactic community, with entities offering technological solutions to environmental problems, social conflicts, and resource limitations. The offer would seem generous, beneficial, and desperately needed. But according to their analysis, acceptance would come with costs that wouldn't become apparent until it was too late. The gradual replacement of human decision-making systems with entity-guided alternatives, the erosion of individual agency in favour of collective efficiency, and the redefinition of human spiritual development to align with entity objectives. It won't feel like conquest, Dr. Rodriguez said. It will feel like salvation, right up until the moment humans realise they've traded their freedom for security, and they're no longer capable of making that trade in reverse. After hours of reviewing evidence and analysis, I asked the obvious question: if the underground Collins elite was right about entity intentions, what could be done to counter them? Marcus and Dr. Rodriguez exchanged glances before Marcus answered carefully. Individual resistance is possible but difficult, he said. The entities rely on collective consent and institutional cooperation. They can't force contact on humans who genuinely reject it, but they can make such rejection seem irrational, antisocial, or harmful. The underground Collins elite had developed what they called spiritual inoculation, techniques for recognizing and resisting entity influence. These included traditional religious practices like prayer and meditation, but also more analytical approaches, questioning the source and motivation behind any message promoting dependence, examining whether proposed solutions increased or decreased human agency, and maintaining strong connections to human community and traditional wisdom. The entities are masters of isolation and dependency, Dr. Rodriguez explained. Their influence is weakest when humans are connected to each other and to their own spiritual traditions, and strongest when individuals feel cut off from community and traditional sources of guidance. But individual resistance wouldn't be enough if the entities succeeded in achieving mass consent for contact. The underground Collins elite believed that their most important function was preserving and disseminating knowledge about entity deception methods, so that future generations would have the tools needed to recognize and resist manipulation. That's why we've maintained this archive, Marcus said, and why we're sharing it with you now. The disclosure campaign is accelerating, and we may not have much time left to prepare people for what's coming. As I write this, the UFO disclosure movement is reaching a crescendo. Government officials are admitting that anomalous aerial phenomena are real. Military personnel are testifying about encounters with craft displaying impossible capabilities. Scientists are calling for serious study of the phenomenon. The public is being prepared for some kind of revelation. But if Collins' elite was right, that revelation might be the culmination of a deception campaign that began thousands of years ago. Think about how perfectly the current disclosure narrative fits the Collins elite framework. We're being told that non-human intelligence has been monitoring humanity, that these beings possess technology that could solve our energy and environmental problems, that contact is inevitable and potentially beneficial. We're being encouraged to view disclosure as a positive development, a step forward in human evolution. But what if it's actually the final step in a plan that began when the first human looked at the sky and wondered if the gods were watching? The entities Collins' elite studied had thousands of years to perfect their understanding of human psychology. They knew that direct domination would eventually fail, that humans would rebel against obvious tyranny, but they also knew that humans could be convinced to surrender their autonomy willingly, if the surrender was framed as enlightenment or advancement. The promise of godhood had worked for ancient peoples. The promise of salvation had worked for medieval societies. And the promise of technological transcendence might be working on us right now. Marcus and Dr. Rodriguez had given me a framework for understanding the entity deception campaign, but they also gave me something more practical. A list of specific indicators that the final phase was beginning. We've been tracking these markers for decades, Dr. Rodriguez explained, showing me a comprehensive timeline of predicted developments. When all of them align, it means the entities believe humanity is ready for open contact. The first indicator was mainstream media normalization of UFO phenomena, not just reporting on UFO incidents, but actively promoting the idea that contact would be beneficial. According to their analysis, this phase had begun in earnest around 2017 and was accelerating rapidly. The second indicator was government disclosure of UAP reality without disclosure of government conclusions about entity intentions. They're admitting the phenomena are real, while carefully avoiding any discussion of what the entities actually want, Marcus noted. This creates public curiosity without public wariness. The third indicator was increased entity activity designed to demonstrate technological superiority while maintaining plausible deniability. The recent UAP videos released by the Pentagon fit this pattern perfectly. Clear evidence of advanced technology, but no direct communication or obvious threat. The fourth indicator was the emergence of credible advocates for contact within scientific, military, and government institutions. People with impressive credentials and no obvious ulterior motives, all promoting the same basic message: that humanity should welcome contact rather than fear it. Look at the current disclosure advocates, Dr. Rodriguez said, showing me biographical information on various scientists and former government officials. Impressive backgrounds, sincere motivations, reasonable arguments, but they're all promoting the same narrative the entities have been pushing for 70 years. The fifth and most disturbing indicator was the systematic suppression of research into entity psychology and motivations. While technological aspects of UAP were receiving increased attention and funding, questions about entity intentions were being dismissed as unscientific or irrelevant. That's how you know the entities are controlling the conversation, Marcus said. Any investigation that might reveal their true agenda gets discredited or defunded, while investigations that support their preferred narrative receive institutional support. According to their tracking system, all 5 indicators were currently active and accelerating. The underground Collins elite believed this meant humanity was within years, possibly months, of formal entity contact. Before I left Georgetown that day, Marcus pulled me aside for a private conversation. "You need to understand what you're walking into," he said quietly. "Everyone who's gotten this deep into Collins elite research has faced the same choice. Drop the investigation or accept that your life is going to change in ways you can't predict or control." He told me about colleagues who had been discredited through carefully orchestrated academic scandals, researchers who had lost funding after questioning entity motivations, investigators who had experienced personal crises that conveniently redirected their attention away from UFO phenomena. The entities don't usually resort to direct intimidation, Marcus explained. It's much more effective to make resistance seem personally costly. Failed relationships, career setbacks, health problems, family conflicts, all timed to coincide with getting too close to the truth. He showed me files documenting the life trajectories of dozens of Collins elite researchers over the past 50 years. The pattern was consistent. People who backed away from the investigation generally experienced improved circumstances, while those who continued faced escalating personal difficulties. "I'm not trying to scare you off," Marcus said, "but you need to know that this isn't just an intellectual exercise. The entities have a vested interest in controlling what humans believe about them, and they've had centuries to develop sophisticated methods for managing troublesome individuals." Dr. Rodriguez had faced similar pressures. Her tenure at Georgetown had been threatened twice due to budget constraints that mysteriously resolved themselves when she temporarily reduced her Collins elite research. Her marriage had ended during a period of intensive investigation into entity influence on religious institutions. Her health had suffered during the years she was most actively documenting entity deception patterns. "But here's the thing," she said. "The difficulties are real, but they're not insurmountable. The entities can make resistance costly, but they can't make it impossible. If they could simply eliminate troublesome humans, Collins elite would never have existed in the first place." She believed that entity limitations were precisely why the deception campaign was necessary. If entities could control human behavior directly, they wouldn't need to spend decades engineering consent for contact. the fact that they relied on manipulation suggested that human free will, while vulnerable to influence, remained fundamentally intact. Over the following months, Marcus and Dr. Rodriguez introduced me to other members of the underground Collins elite network. I was amazed by both the size and diversity of the group. Theologians and physicists, former intelligence analysts and current religious leaders, retired military officers and active researchers. What united them wasn't a shared background or ideology, but a shared conclusion that the UFO phenomenon represented a spiritual threat masquerading as a technological opportunity. Father Michael Torres, a Catholic exorcist based in New Mexico, had been documenting parallels between UFO encounters and demonic possession for 30 years. Dr. Rebecca Walsh, a psychiatrist specializing in religious experiences, had identified specific psychological patterns linking modern abduction accounts to historical accounts of spiritual deception. Colonel James Patterson, retired, former Air Force intelligence, had spent decades analysing UFO incident reports and concluded that entity behaviour was consistent with psychological warfare rather than scientific exploration. Each member of the network brought specialised knowledge and perspective, but all had reached similar conclusions about entity motivations and methods. More importantly, all had experienced some form of pressure or retaliation for their research, confirming the underground Collins elite's assessment that entity influence extended far beyond individual contactee cases. "We're not conspiracy theorists," Dr. Walsh explained during one of our meetings. "We're researchers who followed the evidence to an uncomfortable conclusion. The UFO phenomenon is real, the entities are real, but their intentions aren't what they claim to be." The network had developed sophisticated methods for secure communication and information sharing, operating on the assumption that their activities were being monitored by both government agencies and entity-influenced individuals within those agencies. "We have to assume that any information we share through normal channels will be compromised," Colonel Patterson explained. "But we also can't become so paranoid that we stop sharing information entirely. The entities benefit from our isolation more than our communication." As my involvement with the underground Collins elite deepened, I learned that the network extended far beyond the United States. Religious leaders in Europe, researchers in Asia, indigenous spiritual authorities in South America, all were reporting similar observations about entity activity and deception patterns. Dr. Rodriguez arranged for me to speak with several international contacts via encrypted communication channels. Their perspectives added crucial context to the Collins elite analysis. Brother Antonio Mendez, a Spanish monk who specialized in mystical theology, had been tracking entity influences on contemporary religious movements. His research suggested that entities were actively promoting syncretistic spiritual practices that emphasized cosmic consciousness over traditional religious authority. "They're not attacking religion directly," he explained through a translator. "They're subtly altering it, encouraging beliefs and practices that make humans more receptive to entity guidance and less connected to traditional sources of spiritual wisdom." Dr. Yuki Tanaka, a Japanese researcher studying anomalous phenomena in Buddhist contexts, had identified similar patterns in Asian spiritual communities. Entity influences seem designed to promote meditation practices that open practitioners to external guidance, while discouraging those that strengthened individual discernment and spiritual independence. Maria Santos, a shaman from Peru, described entity encounters that closely paralleled North American UFO contact reports, but framed in terms of traditional indigenous spirituality. The entities consistently promoted abandonment of ancestral traditions in favour of updated spiritual practices more suitable for the modern world. "Same spirits, different masks," she said simply. "They tell each culture what that culture wants to hear, but always with the same goal: make humans depend on them instead of their own traditions and wisdom." The global perspective confirmed the underground Collins elite's assessment that entity activity was coordinated across cultures and belief systems, but adapted to local contexts and expectations. The deception campaign wasn't centered in any particular country or religion. It was targeting human spiritual independence as a universal phenomenon. Based on decades of analysis and current trends, The underground Collins elite had developed a timeline for what they believed would be the final phase of the entity deception campaign. Phase 1, 2020 to 2025, mainstream normalization of UFO phenomena through government disclosure and media coverage. Emphasis on technological aspects while avoiding discussion of entity psychology or motivations. Gradual preparation of public consciousness for the possibility of contact. Phase 2, 2025 to 2030. Increased entity demonstrations designed to showcase technological capabilities and benevolent intentions, possibly including solutions to environmental or energy crises that humanity appears unable to solve independently. Growing public pressure for government contact initiatives. Phase 3, 2030 to 2035, formal contact between entity representatives and human governments. Presentation of comprehensive assistance packages addressing climate change, resource depletion, social conflicts and technological limitations. Initial agreements for limited cooperation and information exchange. Phase 4, 2035 to 2040. Gradual integration of entity guidance into human decision-making systems. Replacement of traditional political, economic and social structures with entity-recommended alternatives. Growing human dependence on entity technology and advice. Phase 5, 2040 plus. Complete transformation of human civilization according to entity specifications. Elimination of independent human spiritual development in favour of entity-directed consciousness evolution. Humanity's transition from independent species to managed resource. The genius of the timeline is that each phase will seem like humanity's choice, Dr. Rodriguez explained. People will vote for leaders who support contact. They'll demand access to entity technology. They'll embrace changes that make their lives easier and more comfortable. Marcus nodded grimly. By the time humans realize they've traded their freedom for security, the infrastructure for independence will have been dismantled. They'll be completely dependent on systems they don't understand, controlled by entities they trusted. The timeline wasn't inevitable, according to Underground Collins' elite analysis, but it was highly probable unless humanity developed widespread awareness of entity deception methods and conscious resistance to manipulation. That's why we're talking to you, Marcus said, and why we've been talking to researchers like you for 50 years. Information is the only weapon we have against this kind of psychological operation. After months of research and analysis, I found myself facing the same choice that every Collins elite researcher had faced since 1947. Accept the implications of what I'd learned, or find a way to dismiss it as paranoid speculation. The evidence was circumstantial but extensive. The pattern was consistent but complex. The implications were staggering but difficult to prove conclusively, and the personal costs of continued investigation were becoming increasingly apparent. My freelance work had dried up mysteriously. Dr. Martinelli had stopped returning my calls after someone complained about my misuse of university resources. My relationship was suffering under the strain of long hours spent on research I couldn't fully explain. My sleep was disrupted by dreams that felt more like memories of conversations I'd never had. But I also couldn't ignore what I'd learned. If Collins' elite was even partially correct, then humanity was walking into the most sophisticated trap in recorded history. And if that trap succeeded, future generations would live in a world where human independence was not just restricted, but literally unthinkable. The choice, ultimately, was between personal comfort and collective responsibility, between individual security and species survival, between the easy path of accepting official narratives and the difficult path of questioning everything I thought I knew about humanity's place in the universe. I chose to continue the investigation. It's been 6 months since my first meeting with Marcus and Dr. Rodriguez, and I'm no longer the same person who stumbled across that footnote in a theological dissertation. The evidence I've gathered has convinced me that Collins' elite was not only real, but correct in their fundamental assessment of the UFO phenomenon. We are not being visited by benevolent space brothers seeking to help humanity evolve to a higher level of consciousness. We are being manipulated by entities that have been perfecting deception techniques for millennia, entities that view humanity as a resource to be managed rather than a species to be assisted. The current UFO disclosure movement, whatever the sincere intentions of its individual advocates, is serving entity interests by preparing humanity to welcome contact rather than question it. The technological solutions being offered through various contact scenarios are not gifts, but baits in an elaborate trap that will close once humanity becomes dependent on entity guidance. And the most terrifying aspect is that it's working exactly as planned. Public opinion is shifting in favour of contact. Government agencies are admitting UFO reality while avoiding UFO psychology. Scientific institutions are studying technological aspects while ignoring behavioural patterns. Religious leaders are embracing cosmic spirituality while abandoning traditional discernment practices. We are being prepared for our own subjugation, and we are enthusiastically participating in the preparation process. But knowledge of a deception campaign, even a sophisticated one, provides power to resist it. The entities Collins' elite studied were powerful and cunning, but they were not omnipotent. Their influence depended on human ignorance, isolation, and consent. When humans understood their methods and refused to cooperate, entity influence diminished significantly. The underground Collins elite has spent 50 years documenting entity weaknesses as well as their strengths. They've developed techniques for recognizing and resisting manipulation. They've maintained networks of communication and support that entity influence cannot completely penetrate, and most importantly, they've preserved knowledge that would otherwise have been lost or corrupted. That knowledge is now available to anyone willing to look for it, question official narratives, and think independently about humanity's future. The choice between freedom and security, between independence and dependence, between human agency and entity guidance remains open. But that choice won't remain open forever. According to every timeline the underground Collins elite has developed, we are rapidly approaching the point where collective consent for entity contact will make individual resistance increasingly difficult and ultimately ineffective. The time for choosing is now. The information needed to choose wisely exists, but it requires effort to find and courage to accept. The consequences of choosing poorly may be irreversible. 60 years ago, Collins' elite tried to warn us. Today, their successors are still trying. Whether humanity listens and whether we choose wisely remains to be seen. But the warning has been delivered. The evidence has been presented. The choice is ours. Maybe that's why you never hear their name in congressional hearings or disclosure reports, because Collins' elite wasn't warning us about aliens. They were warning us about faith in the wrong thing and how easily it can damn us. The question isn't whether Collins' elite really existed. The question is whether they were right. And if they were right, then everything we think we know about the UFO phenomenon might be part of the very deception they tried to expose. The entities they described have had 60 years to perfect their strategy since Collins' elite was terminated. 60 years to learn how to work within our institutions, shape our research, and guide our conclusions. 60 years to make sure that when disclosure finally comes, we'll welcome it with open arms. Because that's what good servants do, they welcome their masters home. But servants can choose to be free. The question is whether they will make that choice while they still can. That's tonight's deep dive into the Collins elite. A story that challenges everything we think we know about the UFO phenomenon and asks uncomfortable questions about the nature of contact itself. What do you think? Was Collins' elite a real government program, or just an elaborate piece of disinformation? And either way, are the questions they were asking the ones we should be asking now? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to suggest topics for future episodes. Your ideas keep sleep theories going, and trust me, we've only scratched the surface of what's hidden in the footnotes of history. Until next time, sleep well and question everything.